Okay, I'm recording. Okay, so anyway, so I'm talking about radio here, and the other thing about it is often people think of radio as off the grid, and that means that you don't need to have a cell tower, you don't need power, and you don't need telephone lines to communicate. It is you can actually talk around the world without having any telephone system or power in your community, which is great. Um, So here's a quote from Albert Einstein, and it says, "The wireless telegraph is not difficult to understand. The ordinary telegraph is like a very long cat. You pull the tail in New York, and it meows in Los Angeles." And it says, "The wireless is the same, only without the cat." So that is wireless. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about things that are radio, just because I think you actually are aware of radio, but may not know that that's what it is. Um, First of all, you have Wi-Fi. So if you're using a wireless device right now, you're using a radio. Um, Most of the time, uh, anything with a satellite radio. So if anyone has the XM satellite, that's actually a radio from a satellite in space. Um, all sorts of handheld devices, your cell phones. Those are all really little radios. Um, Most people don't know it, but your remote control for your garage is a radio. And if you ever want to do something fun, it turns out you can actually snoop those codes, and you can open up other people's garage doors. I wouldn't recommend that, but there's a hacker who got the other one that is similar to that is doorbell. So if you have a wireless doorbell, you can actually snoop the codes off that. And there's a video of a hacker who does that to his friend across the street, and doorbell dishes him for a week until he figured out someone had stolen the code for his wireless doorbell. Microwaves. I bet you a lot of folks don't realize that a microwave is actually a radio. It turns out, believe it or not, the frequency for a microwave is smack in the middle of the same place as your wireless router. It's 2.4 gigahertz. So it's just at a much higher power and concentrated. So if anyone has ever wondered why your Wi-Fi stops working when someone goes to heat up a cup of coffee, that is why. And then also those passes for your car as you go through the toll lane back when you actually could drive. that is also a little radio transponder. So real quick, so folks know the difference between amateur radio and broadcast radio. Everyone, I think everyone's familiar with radio stations. And the big difference between radio station is they are much higher power, and they're one way. And you may have seen these giant towers that they have. And they are very large antennas, and they reach quite a distance. And again, you only listen on one side. So hobby radio, obviously, there's a lot of hobby radio, and amateur radio is the biggest part of hobby radio. And one thing that you might want to tell folks, I know there are some folks who are interested who may have been younger, you can get an amateur radio at any age. You can get a license. I think the youngest one I know about here is 7 years old. So that is amateur radio. Believe it or not, there's actually other parts of the radio spectrum that are hobbies, and that's remote control cars, remote control airplanes, boats. Drones are also radio devices. And this is somebody using citizen band radio, which, by the way, I know a lot of people ask me about that. It doesn't carry very far, and mostly it's the F word and get out of my way. Haven't driven across the country, though it does occasionally become handy, but it doesn't have a lot of range. So the difference with CB is it is not licensed. People don't have to pass a test, and it's kind of not great. So The other one, which I have mentioned on my Twitter account, which could be useful to your family, especially the folks that don't want to get licensed, is the FRS, Family Radio Service, and there's also something called GMRS, and those are you can buy them, and they are mostly useful for talking in a small area. And just so you're aware of those, and I can talk more about those later, but those don't require licensing. GMRS does, but it's just pay the $25, I think, and you have a license. So those are pretty much the Wild West. Okay, so let's talk about radio waves a little bit. So skip that. So let's talk about call signs first. So there's oh, and James says it's $75 for a GMRS license. So let's talk about call signs first. These are kind of useful for understanding radio. Everyone's familiar with radio stations and TV, and if you've noticed radio stations and TV, they actually have call signs. So you're familiar with this. KTLA is a call sign here in Los Angeles. Those are all assigned by the FCC. You don't make them up. They're actually assigned by the FCC for all radio and television and amateur radio. And this is a typical amateur radio call. This is N1ERF. I haven't looked them up, but we'll talk about how that works. So these are some typical ham radio operated calls, and everyone gets their own call, and everyone gets just one. And U.S. ham radio operators have call signs that start with A through AL, and K, N, or W. So if you get somebody with, I think some people, can everyone see my pointer, by the way, if I'm, yes?
Yes.
So, yeah, okay, great.
Yes. Yes.
So the
we see
beginning,
it.
yeah, great. The beginning letter, if it's K, A, N, W, tells you that it's a United States station. And this can be useful when you're talking to people across the world. You imagine if you call out someone on the radio, their call tells you a lot about where they are. So that is the first letter. Anyone who's a pilot might see this might look somewhat familiar, because it turns out the tail numbers on airplanes also use just about the same scheme. So you'll know that in the US they're all N numbers, and that's the same scheme here. So that's that, and then these are numbers. These numbers used to mean something more than they do now, and we'll talk about the call zones. So that number corresponds to a map. Now, it used to be that when you got a call sign, you had to get a call sign with a number that corresponded with your call sign. And for example, mine is AI6YR. Anyone wondering what my Twitter is? It's actually the first part of my amateur radio call. And 6 indicates California. And each different area has their little section of the country. Nowadays, that said, people can get a call from any call letter. So sometimes someone may have moved and they wanted to keep their call, or someone just liked the number better. And so it doesn't always mean anymore that if you've got a 6 that you're from California. Most of the time it is, but not all the time. There's a few out here that KL is Alaska, and KH6, KH7 are Hawaii, KP3, KP4 Puerto Rico, and those are those are generally the case, but not always the case. So when you get a call sign, you're going to end up with by default the one that the state you're in. I saw somebody passing around a map today, just by the way, which was kind of funny, of the Mockingbird, whatever their districts, and I said, oh, hey, we already have those. Anyway, just kidding. So here's an example of a license plate. So it's very common for folks with a amateur radio license to actually have their license for the amateur radio the same as their license plate. And there's a special most states, I think all states, allow you to have a special license plate for your call sign. And mine is actually my call sign. So if anyone's around my neighborhood may have seen me driving around, the guy with a lot of antennas and AI6YR is me, with a car that needs to be washed. So that is the case. And you can ignore that. So so every country in the world has their own call sign. And when you talk to someone, for example, anyone who's a VE station, they're in Canada, and there's one for every single country in the world. So that is call signs. So, and here, for example, is, if you ever talk to Madagascar, is 5R8UI. That'd be 5 Romeo 8 Uniform India, and that would tell you that they're from Madagascar. So that's what a call sign is. And this is Latin America, and you'll see these are all the calls there. So just a few examples. If someone is PW8 right here, then you know that they're from Brazil. And that's always really useful. We call it distant station and DX, and it's actually quite a bit of a thrill to be talking to someone and hear them from across the world. So, okay, so let me go to the next set of slides. Just a second. Oh yeah, there we go. So let's talk about the phonetic alphabet. The phonetic alphabet is something you do want to know about as an amateur radio operator. And the reason why, and this is particularly useful in emergencies, is there are certain things that sound the same. So here the example is Phil and Bill. And if you are on a radio and it's really staticky, you know, Phil and Bill could sound very similar. So, and there are a lot of names and things that can be confused. For example, my name is Ben, and when I first got on the radio, how many people thought I was Dan, D-A-N, as opposed to B-E-N? So it's useful to be able to spell this out. It's also used quite a bit in the fire, emergency, police, military, and they don't all necessarily use the same phonetic alphabet, but the idea. So here is the military phonetic alphabet. You don't have to know these to pass a test. However, you will want to print out the list of the phonetic alphabet. So when people ask you to spell your name, you can do so, or you can also understand their call. These are used quite a bit, and you know, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and everyone's heard these in the war movies and whatnot, and they are used all the time. So my name is Ben, is Bravo, Echo, November, and when you're talking or listening to something far away, it is really, really useful to be able to use this. So there we go. Let's see. Okay, let me open up a new slide. Just a second. Okay, let me see if I can get this to go. Oops, let's see, let's get the right one. Okay, does everyone see the slide with the waves there?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so some people think that radio waves are magic, but they're actually waves. And even though we can't see them, they often look like, they're often displayed like this. This is what a radio wave might look like. This is actually the same way as audio works. So when you hear audio, you'll see that there's actually waves, and radio waves are just much faster than audio waves. They're all the same part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And these really actually move at the speed of light. They're very fast. Anyone know how fast the speed of light is? It's 186,000 miles per second, or that's approximately 300,000 meters per second. So that is how fast. So they are like light. So so let's talk about the simplest radio wave, and this is a line of sight radio wave, which means that the radio waves traveling from one antenna and line of sight is going to another antenna. And this is typically what you would see with a handheld radio. So I know there's some folks who may listen to fire radios or emergency traffic, and that is what you typically have your fire, police, and even your aircraft use. It's called line of sight, very high frequency radio. And line of sight really means literally where you can see. So it's a little bit longer than line of sight, because line of sight for us is light, and radio waves bend a little bit more than light does. So this works great until there's a mountain in the way, and that is something to be aware of with radio just using them, is that obstructions at these frequencies, you can't go through a mountain. And we'll talk about repeaters, and that's one way to figure out how to get around that. Excuse me. And this is why, if you look around, there are often antennas on hilltops. This is because if you're broadcasting off the top of this tower, or if you've got a repeater or a radio from this, it goes a lot farther because it's above the mountains. This is why here in Los Angeles, if anyone has seen Mount Wilson, there's so many antennas on Mount Wilson. It's because it's high up above the ground. Generally, the higher you are, the better. So that is, yeah. So what happens with line of sight when you go far enough? The Earth is curved. Unless anyone here is a flat earther, the Earth does curve, and at some point you're too far away that wave actually can no longer get around the Earth. So that's line of sight signals. And funny story. Someone mentioned they lived below Mount Wilson. I once went to Mount Wilson, and with my car, and I couldn't start my car. And this is before I was an amateur radio operator. And it turns out the power of those radio, the radio transmitters on that mountain are so strong, it was jamming out my my key fob. So I had to actually put my car in neutral and roll down the hill before I could start the car. Okay, so let's talk about bouncing radio signals. Now, because radio signals behave differently, it turns out you can actually bounce them off something called the ionosphere. And the ionosphere is this great big electrical cloud around the Earth. And that ionosphere is something that, at the right frequencies, actually turns out you can send signals around the world. So, for example, you can send a signal from San Francisco and bounce it off the ionosphere, and it'll get to Chicago, and that's at the right frequencies. And you know, those charged particles are a big mirror, and that works. Funny enough, at those frequencies, you're actually going to skip over Denver, so you can't use those frequencies to talk to San Francisco. And that's called a skip zone, skip distance. You don't have to know too much about that, except for the really cool thing is you can actually bounce them again. And for example, you can bounce from San Francisco to Chicago, and then it bounces off of Chicago and goes all the way to some island somewhere off in the Atlantic. So that is called skip. And I think I have the next slide here. And believe it or not, you can actually skip a signal all the way across the Earth. So the farthest I've spoken to someone on radio has been from California to China, and going all across the Earth, nothing but 100 watts of power. So that is skipping a signal across the Earth. if you and yeah, someone asked if you can talk to someone in Sydney, Australia. It's actually very easy to talk to someone in Sydney, Australia. In fact, I'm not sure tonight, but you generally hear them on from California every night. So it's easy to talk to folks in Australia. A second. Turn on the radio in the background. So one thing that's pretty cool is actually you can go all the way around the Earth, and in fact, there's a little bit of a delay. You can actually hear yourself. It's almost like an echo. You can hear your own signal all the way around the Earth, and that's kind of cool when that happens. So that's called skip, just so you know what that is. So
how long is the delay for that?
It turns out the delay. The calculation is because it's going 186,000 miles per second, and the all the way around the Earth is 25,000 miles. It turned out to be 0.134 seconds, which is a tenth of a second. I haven't done this myself, but some of the high power station guys, I hear them talking about it. They actually can hear themselves as an echo all the way around the Earth. It's kind of cool.
Ben, quick question. So
Yes.
radio is a light wave too?
So light is a radio wave as well. They're all part of the same spectrum. In fact, audio is at the low end of the spectrum, the vibration, and as you go up, radio becomes radio for your handheld is a lower VHF. But eventually you get to microwave signals, and they use gigahertz signals now. Everyone heard about 5G, and light is actually also a radio wave. Okay, so let's see here. Ignore that. So I want to talk about WWV, which is a concept you'll like to know about. WWV is actually a radio station near Fort Collins, Colorado, and it uses high-performance antennas to transmit signal all over the world, and it actually sends out time and other information. So if anyone here has an atomic watch or atomic clock, there's not actually an atomic anything in your watch. It actually uses the signals from WWV to coordinate and set your watch. And there's a little radio receiver in there, believe it or not. So this is a picture of WWV. This is in Fort Collins. Anyone who might be in Fort Collins may have seen that. I haven't. And there's an atomic clock in Boulder, Colorado, and then this is the transmitter. And there's another one in that's their antenna, and I haven't seen those either. And this is WWVH, which is a very similar radio station, which is in Kauai, Hawaii, which also uses the same frequency. So you can hear these in all over the world, but they use the same frequencies and they're coordinated. So interestingly enough, they send the same signals out, except for there's a voice, and the voice is there's a male voice, which is for the Colorado one, and there's a female voice for the Hawaii one. And I think there's a recording in here that we can play. Yeah, here, let's see if we can play this.
Altitude 9 hours, 0 minutes, coordinated universal time. National Institute of Standards and Technology time. This is radio station WWV, Fort Collins, Colorado. National internationally allocated standard carrier frequencies of 2.5, 5, 10, 15, and 20 megahertz, providing time of day, standard time interval, and other related information.
Okay, so that's WWV and WWVH. There's a lot of things you can do with it. You can set your watch to it, or your watch will automatically set to it. The other thing is you can figure out what radio waves are working, and something that you probably won't understand till later, but it's nice to be able to dial up and down and figure out what is the propagation. and propagation is how far is your radio waves going. And you can tell by tuning into the different WWV stations. And Chris has a great link there if you want to look at that. And okay, so let's talk about DX. Anyone know what, who's not a ham radio operator, know what DX might stand for?
Distance.
Yes, DX is distance. And so DX is distance, and amateur radio operators love distance because it's a little bit of a technical challenge. And there's no exact amount of distance which is defined for DX, but it depends on what band you're on. So if you're using a handheld, talking from where I live in Ventura County, California, to San Diego would be considered distance because it's quite, I think, 100 miles or something. Anyway, whatever it is, it's a long distance. Whereas if I'm using a high frequency radio, you know, I can talk to people all over the United States, and that's not considered DX. But if I talk to somebody in Peru, that would be DX. And so that's the idea behind DX. And there's a lot of people who do that just for fun in amateur radio. So DXing is pursuing distant stations. And then there's something that I think is kind of cool, which is called DXpeditions, where people actually go to a far off location and run. And this is an actual one. I guess this is Scarborough Reef in the South China Sea. There's probably a Chinese landing strip on that by now. Just kidding. Anyway, we definitely go out to remote areas, and this is somewhat applicable to the whole emergency thing, because you can see you're running a generator and you're running an antenna and you're having to operate in interesting areas. So they are a lot of fun. So okay, so let's talk about the ITU and the FCC. And these are actually some of the questions that you get on the amateur radio exam. And the ITU, let's see if I can get here, is the International Telecommunication Union, and you do need to know that. That is a part of the United Nations, and they all decide to, you know, obviously because radio doesn't have any borders, you have to agree as a international body on how you want to use it. If you don't agree, then you know everyone would be stepping on each other, and it does require that all the different countries coordinate and abide by the rules. So I have to mention that it's interesting because sometimes we will hear people using parts of the radio spectrum that are supposed to be for amateur radio operators, and you'll hear a broadcast station from China or something like that, or infamously, the Russians have radar called over the horizon radar, which they shouldn't be using in those bands, but they do anyway. So anyway, the ITU is the group that coordinates it, and they're headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. Now, everyone should be aware of the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, and that is the group that handles everything about radio in the United States. And I think everyone's heard of the FCC. And you get your radio license theoretically from the FCC, and you actually have to get your call from the FCC as well. So that is the legal aspects of it. And there's a bunch of questions we'll look at later which have to do with that. So, okay. Great. I'm going to pull up one more set of slides here, and then maybe we'll have anyone have questions before I go on. We're almost at the end of the hour, so. Okay, so let me bring up another slide, and then just one more before we end for today. Okay, actually I need to open up the right slides. Just a second. Okay, some of this stuff is, now we're going into the, let me get the slides back up. Screen sharing. Okay. Okay, can everyone see the electromagnetic spectrum screen now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so we won't be able to go through the whole thing here, but we'll start on this. So even though I showed you earlier how electromagnetic wave looks like, we haven't talked about frequencies yet. So this is an example of what frequency means. You know, radio waves are always traveling and they're also in motion. And if you were to time those radio waves, you would see that they take up, you know, 1 second here. If this was 1 second, there's this one has a wave that takes up 1 second, and this is multiple waves for 1 second. And that is called the cycles per second, and we call that hertz. So if anyone has heard hertz, H-E-R-T-Z, and so this is 1 cycle per second, that's 1 hertz. And this one has 9 repetitions of that wave, which is 9 hertz. And that is what frequency is. So that is frequency. So let's talk about wavelength. So for example, here you can see that there are peaks and valleys in all of these waves. And that is 1 wavelength. It's between the 2 peaks of this signal. And down here, for example, there's 1, 2, 3 of these in this particular wave. So you'll see that, you know, in this one period of time, this one has 1 and this one has 3, and that's the frequency. So the longer the wavelength, the lower the frequency. So the longer the distance between here, the less often this goes up and down. And so a higher frequency obviously has more in that time, and that's a higher wavelength. One thing to know, interesting thing about all these is there's less energy in these, the longer wavelengths, and there's more in the higher wavelengths. So this is why you know, you use 2.4 gigahertz for your microwave, because there's a lot more energy when you're going faster. So longer wavelengths are lower frequencies and lower energy. Shorter wavelengths, these are shorter wavelengths and higher frequencies and higher energy. So, and these are all concepts, and we'll talk more about those as it regards to the test. But anyway, the idea is that so you have an idea of what frequencies are. So, so let's, I'm going to show you some of the spectrum here. So there are various parts of the radio spectrum, and they are divided by ranges, and you don't have to know all of them because there's a lot of them, but just so you might understand how they're divided, there is first of all, medium frequency is where you'll find AM radio, marine radio, and some ham radio bands. Then you have HF for high frequency, and that is used for shortwave broadcasts. And this is where most of the ham radio operators use HF, and that's for international or long distance communications. And VHF, very high frequency, and that's used for broadcast TV, FM radio, business, and also ham radio. And these are line of sight frequencies. So for the folks who are wondering about scanner frequencies and listening to the police and fire, those are VHF, very high frequency radio bands, and also higher than that, UHF. And we'll, that one is UHF. And that is cell phones, police again, fire again, and ham radio. And so that is the general categories of them. and they actually have different frequency ranges with numbers. And so MF is 300 kilohertz to 3 megahertz. You don't have to remember those, but you know, it's good to know the ranges. High frequency, and as you go in and you start using these using amateur radio, you'll figure out what kind of frequency works with different equipment. And so that is just the general ranges. So I'm going to show you, these are the 4 frequency groups we talked about. There are a lot more that we're not going to talk about, but if you ever wanted to know that they exist, there are a lot of other frequencies here. So these are the lower ones here, and believe it or not, we're using some of these frequencies now. Anyone know what the frequency of voice is? Sound? So sound's all over here in the extremely low frequency range, I believe. Super low frequency. I think they're all here. And let's see here, just a second. Sonar is actually in here too. I don't know what sonar is. I could look it up on another screen. I think sonar is extremely low frequency or super low frequency somewhere too. So, and then I think my next slide actually goes all the way hot, all the way up the top, and you can go super high frequency, extremely high frequency, and tremendously high frequency. None of which we use, except for I think well, some of these you could probably use, but there's quite a few different areas. So there's some places where ham radio operators play with, and so that's talking to space stations or in the gigahertz range. And there's a lot of other stuff that we don't have to do anything with, but it's kind of fun. Okay, so just I'm going to finish this up, and then we'll go. Let's see, we've talked about that. So I'm going to finish this up, and then we'll continue from here the next time around. But MF, we're going to look at the medium frequency range. And the FCC assigns the large portion of this band to be AM broadcast. So when you turn on your AM radio, that is in this little range here. So if anyone knows, like here in California and LA, we have AM 1070. Well, 1070 is 1070 kilohertz, and that ends up being somewhere in the smack middle of here. So that is AM broadcast. And of course, that's something you would listen to in your car or whatever. And then at the top end of this, there's actually marine frequencies, and these are used actually far offshore. These are not used like locally, but these are if you are way off between here and California and Hawaii, for example, you might use those frequencies as well. And there's a little section of the of this whole band, which is amateur radio, 160 meters, and that is one piece of our frequency. So
so Ben, we need to memorize. We don't need to memorize the actual numbers, but we need to memorize that AM broadcast is.
Actually, I'll go double check the questions, but there are a few questions where you have to memorize where the amateur radio bands are,
Okay.
but you don't have to memorize any of this. It's just, this is so you understand where it is. There are definitely some questions about where certain bands are, and we'll talk about those when we get to the questions.
Okay.
Yeah, there's actually a nice chart which the ARRL has, but you guys end up only having to know like 4 or 5 of them. So okay, so we're at an hour, and I know some folks had other things to do. So my plan is to definitely do this in a day and a half. Someone asked about reading in the book before next time. There's the first section of the book, if you've got the ham radio license manual, is covered a lot of the materials we're talking about. So chapter, I would go through chapter 1 and beginning of chapter 2, and that's what we're going through right now. So chapter 1 and chapter 2, if you're interested in looking, if you've got a book, and then we'll go on further from that after that. So great. Anyway, thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll stick around if you have any questions.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.
Thanks a
Hey, Ben.
lot.
Thank you very much.
Ben, hi. Thank you so much for your session. How do we connect with you? You said every other day. So,
Yeah. So my plan is to do it the same time on Wednesday, and I will. Well, if you're on the thread on Twitter that I have, then I will. We'll just use the same conference. How about that?
okay, that helps. No, I was not on the thread on Twitter. I just happened to receive the link from someone.
Okay.
But if how can we follow you on Twitter? Is it just your name or?
It's actually here. I'll type it out there.
Let me see.
Yeah. So it's in the chat thing. So that's my Twitter handle. Just
Okay.
be warned, you're going to get a bajillion posts on the latest disaster.
Oh yeah, no, not an issue. Perfect. Thank you so much. So for Wednesday, we'll follow the same link then.
Yeah, follow the same link. I'll leave this here, and then we'll use the same link into the conference.
Excellent. Thank you so much for today. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks.
Ben, quick comment.
Yes.
So first of all, I thought this was excellent. I thought it was really helpful, and I'm hoping that maybe you can get, well, I know for me, you'll make me a ham radio operator after this class. So I hope you can do it for a whole bunch of people. I thought it was great the way you did the whole thing. Couple things. Yeah, it's great if you could record it just in case, maybe somebody's not able to get in and watch it at the time that you're doing it. And if you can post that. And then also, so what time do you think you'll do it on Wednesday, the same time?
Same time.
Same time. And what would be great is, I don't know if after your series of classes or maybe in the middle, but well, first of all, as far as studying, would you recommend reading certain chapters to study ahead?
Yeah, you know what? If you want to read over the chapters, it might be helpful just so you've seen the material before. The most useful thing is actually looking at the questions, the ham study questions, and the reason why is that is the stuff that you have to pass the test with, and the sooner you start looking at that, the better. So, go to the hamstudy.org. Some of it won't make a lot of sense, but just seeing the questions and figuring out the answers is really useful. So if you've ever, done any testing, sometimes it's useful to just look at it, even though we haven't talked about them yet.
All right, and just one last thing, just on the, so maybe, I guess you'll always take questions during the session or after, but, in case maybe there's stuff, I'm just thinking about there's some stuff when I went through the book and the questions that still don't make sense to me. So maybe, I don't know if it would be at the end or just while we're going over it in middle of one of the sessions, then maybe we could bring it up. But yeah, I just really appreciate it.
Yeah. Definitely ask me questions when we come to those topics.
Okay.
Or if we're going over stuff and I haven't covered it, then definitely ask the question. That's why I wanted to do this interactively, is because there's stuff that just doesn't make sense, and if it doesn't, then I want to explain it.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Hey, Ben,
Yes.
this is Frank. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. How do we get a hold of this book? Did you have a link on that in the beginning? I may have missed it.
Yeah, it's in the, if you look it up, it's called the ARRL, Ham Radio License Manual. And it's on Amazon, and it, actually I recommend Amazon right now. The ARRL sells it, but I think they just closed their doors like everyone else, and Amazon's still shipping. So it's the
Okay.
ARRL Ham Radio License Manual.
Great.
And make sure you get the latest edition, which is the 4th edition.
4th edition.
Yeah, the one that's in the chat there.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
And
Bye.
just one last note, you mentioned your slides you would post on YouTube, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And I'm assuming
Yeah,
your
so my
and-
YouTube
yeah.
account is not up there. Let me tell you what my YouTube account is as soon as I figure it out.
Great.
Um,
Thank you.
Easiest way to get to my YouTube account, because I don't have enough followers to actually have a good link, is look up AI6YR. And it'll say ham radio and other assorted videos from AI6YR. And
I see it. Okay.
Yeah, it's a nonsense channel name. Here, I'll link it. It's a mess, but there's
Perfect.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's my YouTube link. There's all sorts of random stuff on there. But I will try to post this up there as well.
Great. Thank you so much again.
No problem.
For your
Anyone else with questions?
I have a question. This is Chris.
Yeah.
I'm coming back into ham radio after a really long time. As a kid, I was building Heathkit radios in the early 80s, late 70s. And so been doing a lot of SDR stuff. But is there a site that kind of sums up the difference in the hobby now versus, say, a couple decades, and just kind of what are the current issues and what maybe has changed? Because I'm still thinking in the a lot of old information I probably don't need anymore.
Yeah, you know what? There's definitely been a shift. A lot of the stuff is Morse code's not required anymore. There's some new areas that are question areas that they have. There's a lot more digital things that are going on. In fact, quite a bit. So there's no one spot. The ARRL is the U.S. organization, has some online information. And they have a new magazine which is actually kind of useful. You may want to click into that. Let me tell you what that is called. Just a second.
While he's going for that, the information you learned back in the 80s, the electronics portion of it, is still quite relevant. All of the things that you learned about frequency propagation, signal generation, all of that is still.
Yeah, the electronics hasn't changed.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so here's the one. If you're interested, there is On the Air magazine, which is somewhat useful if you're just trying to figure out what's going on, and that's on the ARRL website.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Hey Ben, real quick question. This is Ivan.
Yes.
So I have a ham radio set up in my truck, and I've never used it. I have it on my truck for safety because I don't have a license yet. So just in case I do a lot of photography out in the wild. So just in case I need it, in case I get in trouble. And so thanks for doing this. I'm going to get this license, and so I'm legal. But one question I had is finding the right antenna for my rig that's not one that just attaches to your window. Will you be covering that at all in the course, or are there any recommendations of where we can find this? I've gone down the rabbit hole looking for specific antennas, and the information is just everyone has an opinion.
Yeah, so you'll learn that if you ask amateur radio operators for their opinion on something, so you ask 10 amateur radio operators what they want, you'll get 25 answers. So I can give you some suggestions. So you can ping me, but there's definitely everyone has their favorite.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no
See you
problem.
next week.
Yeah,
See you
great.
in a couple days.
Yeah, Wednesday.
Ben, I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Karen showed us a GoFundMe page. Is that where we can donate to your cause for giving us this awesome class?
I haven't seen this page yet, so.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, that one works. I built that. I put that one up for the Woolsey fire. If you'd like to, yeah, I'm doing this for free. So.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think
Yeah.
we all appreciate that. My second question is, I have a couple of grandsons that are in the Scouts, and I'm wondering if this class would be a good one for them if they do not have their radio badge.
Yes. In fact, we're covering everything that they have to know in the radio merit badge, aside from doing the contacts.
Okay, so they could come in next class and gather some good information.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, funny enough is whoever developed the Scout radio merit badge actually overlaps 100% what's required for a license. So if you do that merit badge and you study the questions, they actually can pass the test. Very few of them do, but it's the same material.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Additionally, something else. The Scouts are getting ready to do their Jamboree fairly soon. Jamboree on the air. So this will be a good intro in preparation for that.
Great. Okay. Other questions?
Hey, Ben, this is Chris. I caught you on Twitter. I was in the midst of the Thomas fire, and I just want to say I appreciate you setting this up and everything. I just wanted to see, do you think there's any way of setting up like a Slack channel or a forum for it, like Facebook group maybe?
Yeah, I could throw a Slack channel up or something like that.
Cool. And then I've been in some classes at the Santa Barbara City College that had a really good system for testing remotely, and
Right.
it really like listens to all of the sounds. You have to make sure you like shut all your windows. It's a little Big Brother, but I do think it works, or at least it worked for them.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so they haven't figured it out because it's a you know, they've been doing it in person for so many years. I don't know if they figured it out yet, but anyway, there's a chat window in here if you can get to it. By the way, if that would work too.
Yeah, I guess that works too.
Yeah.
And then I'm also happy to help you out wherever need be.
Okay, great.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. Question?
Ben, one more thing I just thought of was, you know that pinned tweet you have on your Twitter account?
Yes.
It would be cool if you could actually, during one of your classes, just show us your setup there and explain what we're looking at and how it works.
Yeah, I could do that. Yeah, that's that I still have it pinned there because it's kind of useful during the fires. That's what we've been using to listen to what's going on around California and elsewhere as well. And that's a lot more technical than what I'm going to talk about here, but it's definitely it's something if you're a techie and you can put those together, they're a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Okay, anyone else? Good. Well, okay. Well, I'm gonna close this out, and thanks everyone for coming by. And I'll post this to my YouTube account in Wednesday at 7 p.m. Pacific.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.